Everyone, and welcome to part three of our podcast series on treatments for drug addiction and solutions for homelessness in San Francisco. So, in part one of this series, we talked a bit about the magnitude of this problem, how many people are involved, particularly how many people are homeless, what the availability of beds are in the city that people can access for free, etc. In part two, we talked about current services and current locations that are available for people who have an addiction problem that they want to try to manage, or who are unhoused and want to find a bed for the night or for longer term. So part one was an intro. Part two was, okay, these are the services that are available right now in San Francisco. And there are actually quite a few, but clearly some gaping holes given that more than 4,000 people are still spending nights on the streets in San Francisco. And of those 4,000, and some probably at least 1,500 have serious drug problems. So, we're looking at a problem that has a substantial magnitude and, causes a lot of human suffering and some death as well. So today we're going to talk about possible solutions to these problems, at least things that can make things better for the people who are suffering here, for the people who are outside and want to be in, or for the people who are addicted and want to try to get sober. We'll also talk a little, by the way, about people who don't want to come in. Generally, that's associated with some form of mental illness, although there are some people who are not mentally ill who actually just prefer to live outside. But that really is a minority of the people that are involved here. So let's talk about possible solutions. Now, these are things that don't currently exist. Okay, so in part two of this series, we talked about the places, the programs that do exist for folks in this situation. But what about things that maybe we should have that don't exist, or things maybe we should be doing that we're not doing? So I'm going to divide up the groups here. We'll talk about people who are involuntarily homeless, people who have mental illness, which is often involved in this, and people who have drug addiction, which is also often involved in this. So about more than half the people who are on the street in any given night either have mental illness or drug addiction, or both. So we're talking about thousands of people here in San Francisco. Okay, so when we talk about homelessness and, what services are available in the last podcast, we talked about how most people who are homeless and outside but want to be inside to sleep take advantage of the shelters, and there's more than 3,000 shelter beds available in San Francisco. But given that there's more than 8,000 people who don't have housing, who are living in San Francisco, that's the 3,000 plus beds just isn't enough to accommodate everybody. And not everybody wants to go into a shelter for various reasons on any given night. Some because of mental illness, and some because the environment of the shelter is unpleasant for folks. Some people consider it dangerous, particularly women. And some people just find it, it's like too loud, too dirty, too much going on to actually get any sleep. So there's a number of reasons that people choose not to use shelters, and some of them are perfectly valid reasons. So let's first address the homelessness situation. What can we do to improve things for folks who actually want to be inside at night Um, and I wouldn't say, I mean, one simple answer you could give is just, well, build more shelters or create more shelters. Well, given that a lot of people don't want to stay in the ones that exist, I think better solutions there are either to improve the shelters that exist, and I'll talk about a couple of small ways to do that, or finding an alternative to shelters like they're doing in many cities now. And we'll talk in more depth about that. So, uh, first of all, the shelters that exist, a lot of them are just general shelters. They'll pretty much let anyone in, who can get in line and, wait to reserve a bed for the night, um, regardless of, gender or ethnicity or anything else. And of course, you don't have to pay in a shelter. But we also have shelters that are more targeted in population. Like we have women's shelters, which are just for women. And we have teen shelters, which are just for underage people under 18. And those targeted shelters, those are population-specific shelters, they tend to be nicer in the sense of have a better atmosphere. Of course, they also tend to be smaller, but they tend to have a better atmosphere. There's more of a natural camaraderie among the people in them because, they share certain characteristics. And so I think that, I mean, I am in favor of increasing shelters in the city, but I think we should do it in a population-specific way, like, more women's shelters, more maybe shelters for, transgender, gay, lesbian, shelters for families, because some homeless folks are families, they have kids. Shelters, again, for teens, which we do have. So I'm in favor of having creating more shelters so there's more beds available, but also having shelters be more targeted. I also think that most shelters should be gender segregated, male and female, in a sense of, there have been very credible reports of women not being safe in a general shelter where there's also men, whereas women tend to be pretty safe in women's only shelters. So I actually think even the shelters that do exist should probably be, some kind of division put in, and they should be gender segregated. Also, this business about waiting in line every day to re-reserve essentially your place in the shelter, I think that's quite a burden on people who already have a lot of burdens. So I do think that, once somebody has waited in line and gotten a bed, if they want to, reserve that shelter bed for a number of days or a week, I think they should be able to do that without having to wait in line every day. And I get that could lead to a number of empty beds, every night. So there's an argument against it, but I think the burden of having to wait hours to re-reserve the same bed night after night is just too much. But to be honest, my biggest recommendation for the homelessness problem is we need an alternative to shelters and the streets. So it shouldn't really be a choice, which it is for most people. For most people in this situation, it's really a choice between I go in a shelter or I stay on the street. I think there needs to be an alternative to those two. A lot of people don't want to be in communal shelters, and you can see why. So a number of cities have piloted various programs where there is an alternative to shelters or the streets. There's a third path, essentially, if you want a free place to sleep at night. And that's either tent or tiny house communities or city rented motel rooms. So these are the real difference here is you get your own space. Whereas in a shelters are mostly communal spaces, bunk beds crammed together in a large room, no privacy, loud, noisy, and no, you don't have your own place. So there's no real safe place to store your stuff. When you fall asleep, anybody can walk by and take things. So in a it's possible to build specific areas. These are areas that are leased or purchased by the city or owned by the city or county, where the city or county deliberately puts in a little community of tents. And when I talk about tents here, these aren't those tiny little personal tents, the little A-frame things that are barely big enough for you to lay down in. These are large standing tents. So the tent communities that they've built for homeless encampments are actually very large standing tents. So when I say standing, I mean you can actually stand up and walk around in them. That's how much space is in them. So they feel more like a real room. And you can also do the same thing with tiny houses. These days, cities can purchase prefabricated tiny houses, and if they don't need plumbing, which these wouldn't, then you can do that fairly cheaply. So cost-wise, I think a prefab tiny house, like a little whatever 200, 300 square foot house, prefab tiny houses you can purchase for maybe $5,000, somewhere in that range, probably between 5 and 10. The large standing tents are about 1,000 each. So cheaper to make a tent community than a tiny house community. But you need the land here. So the city has to have access to open land, essentially flat space, that it either can lease or purchase or owns outright. And then, it can put in, 50 tents, 100 tents, 50 little houses, 100 little houses. And, then have people move into these things. And there are a lot of advantages to this kind of communal living. Because it is kind of a community. And you can even, a pilot program that they've done with 10 communities in Marin, which is a little north of San Francisco. They actually piloted a tent community. They took down a sort of a homeless encampment in the street, and offered the people living there space in a tent community in a lot that the city had purchased. And it set up, I think, 50 or 60 tents, large tents in. And that community also had communal tents. So it had, like you would find in an army base, like a mess tent, right? A big tent where people could get together and, socialize or, have food or whatever. And of course, in these tent and tiny house communities, the tents and tiny houses themselves don't have bathrooms, but there are communal bathrooms on site. So, there'll be, 5 or 10, whatever, porta potties that, people can use, from the community. So in the Marin tent community, they also have a security guard. So it's got 24/7 security. It's got, bathrooms, but enough bathrooms to accommodate folks. It's got a communal tent. It's got, individual tents for people to stay. And once people get in, they can stay for up to, I think, a year. And so far in that Marin community, about half the tents they've given are now occupied by people who were formerly homeless. And in interviews, they seem to really like this kind of living. It offers a lot of advantages over shelters. You have your own space. It's a relatively safe space because they've got a security there. The bathrooms are communal, but your sleeping space is yours. And you can store your stuff in relative safety, and but there's also places to socialize, and so really it's like a little mini city, but the idea is to get people out of like haphazard street-based, sidewalk-based encampments, which tend to get very grimy and unsafe, and get them into these more managed communities where There are good facilities like bathrooms, mess tents, your own space, a larger space than you would get on the sidewalk. So people can really feel more human, like they're really in a real living space in a real community. And you don't get that feeling on the street generally, and you certainly don't get it in a shelter, particularly having to re-reserve the shelter bed constantly. So, these are, I think, very good alternatives. The stumbling block here, not so much the cost of putting up the structures, because these structures are pretty cheap. Probably the bigger issue financially is the cost of the space itself, the area that the city would either have to lease or purchase or own, where these communities can be set up. But the idea here is to sweep the streets to get people off it, but then offer them these spaces in these communities to replace it, which is going to be, in almost all cases, much better than how they were living, although not always as convenient. And we'll talk about that. A lot of people some people who are homeless get very attached to the location that they're in. They're close to things that they want to be close to. And of course, these community spaces are going to be probably not close to where the folks were staying before. So, people may be reluctant because they feel displaced and not near things they want to be near. But in any case, there's been some success with this. Now, a slightly different model, but the same sort of idea, is in Los Angeles. LA's been running this program for the last couple of years under the new mayor's regime, where the city pays for motel rooms. The city rents motel rooms around the city in, kind of rundown, cheap motels, and then offers those rooms to people who are unhoused when they sweep the streets. So it's like, do you want to stay, instead of sleeping here in your tent on the sidewalk, do you want to stay in this motel room? And the idea is the same. You have your private space, you have access to, restroom facilities, maybe something to, microwave or hot pot or something to cook with. So this program has been working reasonably well. It's got about 20% of the people who take advantage of it have actually end up getting a job and getting into their own, place that they can pay for. So that's, 20% is not wonderful, but it's not bad. It's much better than the percentage that people go straight from the street to that. So, and then the other thing LA does is they have caseworkers that, are assigned certain buildings, certain motels, where they every day go and visit everyone in those motels and, check on their needs, making sure that, like, if they need medications, they're getting their meds, trying to connect them with job placement services, all kinds of stuff. So it's not just the room that they get, it's also services that they get. And you can also do that, at least theoretically, in these tent or tiny house communities, if you have, if the city assigns social workers and caseworkers to those areas, which I think they should, in addition to the security guards. So, I think that the social work part of this has to be part of this. Just moving people into these communities, while it may make them feel better, about themselves, about their lives, it won't necessarily help them progress, to something better unless you get some caseworkers to work with them one-on-one. And so that should be part of this model too, as it is in LA. Now, the problem with the LA program is working reasonably well. I mean, not extremely well, but reasonably well. The problem with it is it's very expensive. Because, literally the city is spending its own city money to rent out thousands and thousands of motel rooms a night at whatever their rate is, $50 a night or something. So it's you know, it costs the city, probably $50,000, 100,000 a night for one night, that program. And so they're looking over a course of a year at tens of millions of dollars from the city budget. And that's been the stumbling block of that program. Everybody is saying, yeah, it's a nice program, but it's not going to last forever, because the city can't afford it. And, there's some truth to that. So it may be that the tent or tiny house communities, particularly if the city can lease land, these little plots of land cheaper, or if it actually can use plots that it owns, can be a less expensive alternative to that LA model. The LA model, don't get me wrong, is not a bad model, but it's helped, but it's not sustainable financially. Okay, so those are some of my ideas on the homelessness issue. Now let's remember these other two issues, mental illness, drug addiction, are related because more than half of folks who are homeless have one or both of these problems, and that's contributing to their homelessness. So you also have to deal with the mental illness issue and the drug addiction issue. And although I'm pretty, I can have a liberal bent on a number of issues, foreign and domestic, there is one issue where I have a pretty conservative mindset, but I'm going to explain that to you. And that's my feeling about how to deal with people who are on the street who are mentally ill. And if you walk down any road in San Francisco in the Tenderloin these days, you'll see quite a few people who are certainly in this category. And it's heartbreaking, because from our outside perspective, they're living, kind of horrific lives. From their inside perspective, in their heads, they may not be fully aware that they are. But the bottom line is, if nothing is done for them, their lives will never get better. Because if they're dealing with like an ongoing mental illness like schizophrenia, manic depression, bipolar disorders, those don't generally get better on their own, at least not until you're very old. So my feeling with people whose mental illness is contributing to their situation is that they should be subjected to forced treatment. And I know that is definitely not a popular liberal outlook. But, if you look at the history of this, we have a bad history when it comes to forcing people into mental institutions. For most of our history, when I say our, I mean the United States, for most of our history here in this country and in Europe too, people who are mentally ill could be involuntarily committed pretty easily. All it would take was just somebody basically pointing them out, and they would toss them in a mental institution until they got better, which they often never did, because mental institutions are horrific places. And so, you would have these situations like they depicted in the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in the 70s, which was actually depicting this problem, because it was based on a book that was describing the problem of people being involuntarily committed who weren't even necessarily mentally ill. They were just sort of unruly, or criminal. A lot of them engaged just in petty crimes or were using drugs. And they were declared mentally ill and stuck in institutions for pretty much ever, for decades, when they could never get out. So that was, when we started getting to more enlightened times, particularly the late 60s, the 1970s, when ironically Ronald Reagan was governor of California, a new law for commitment of mentally ill was written by Democrats here in California. And Ronald Reagan signed this law. And basically the law let most people who were institutionalized out of the institutions. And it made it extremely hard to commit somebody. There had to be, a very elaborate and expensive court case done before somebody could actually be involuntarily committed. And there, it had to be initiated by a family member, usually. But I think more than one person had to agree or initiate. And that this law, by the way, that Reagan signed was the law that established the 5150 rule. So instead of involuntary commitment, you had this 5150 where pretty much any law enforcement officer or doctor could declare someone a danger to themselves or others, and that would allow you to involuntarily commit them for 3 days. And sometimes that could be extended a few more days. But basically, after a week, you'd have to let them go. If you needed to keep them longer than that, you'd have to go through a very long, contentious court case. So that law was signed back when Reagan was governor of California. And it's been the law the whole time since, until last year, when Governor Newsom in California signed a couple of new laws, making it a bit easier to involuntarily commit people for at least some extended period of time, maybe a period of months. They now he established what are called care courts, where people who are declared mentally ill could be, temporarily and voluntarily committed for treatment. And another law which expanded the concept of mental illness to include serious drug addiction. Before, drug addiction and alcoholism were not considered mental illnesses, and you couldn't commit somebody for those things. But under the new laws, you can, and people can now be committed by pretty much anyone who spends time with them, healthcare worker, law enforcement, family member, or even a friend can get you into a care court by saying this person needs to be committed for treatment, and then there's a relatively quick hearing, not the big elaborate hearing from the old version, where you can be involuntarily committed. So given that law is now on the books and the laws have changed in California, I actually think we should make use of it. And here's why I think that, because a lot of people, particularly people I'm close to, are very against this. They're like, it's a violation of civil liberties. It's a violation of free will. People have rights not to get treated if they don't want to. And what I say to that is yes, but only if they're in their right mind. That is, if you can think rationally and in your rational state make a decision that you don't want treatment, that's one thing. But if you are not rational, if your mind isn't functioning in any kind of real world rational way, then you really don't have a choice. Choices come from our heads. And if our heads aren't working right, if our mental state is such that we can't actually form rational thoughts and use logic and connect actions to consequences, then we're not in a state where we can make a choice like that. Whether we want to accept treatment or not accept treatment, we're just not in that state where we can choose that. The choice is coming from illness, not from a healthy, place. So I'm in favor of not giving people a choice. I'm in favor of, if, we come across people who are homeless, who are in obviously impaired mental state, that's not, by the way, that's not related to being high on drugs. Um, and and because of that impaired mental state, they're living in filth and degradation, then we shouldn't allow them to just continue living in filth and degradation endlessly. To me, that's inhumane. What we should do is we should take them in involuntarily, take them quickly through this process of evaluation and care according, and then get them some treatment. Force treatment on them. Yeah, force it on them. And so I'm in favor of doing that, giving them a 30-day, yeah, you've got to take your meds or whatever for 30 days and treat you for 30 days. Get you into a more rational state where you can actually apprehend the world more or less as it is. And once they are in that state, then they can make choices. Then we ask them, what do you want to do? Do you want to keep living the way you're living? Or would you like to try to live a healthier, less dangerous way? And then, of course, once they're in a rational or semi-rational state and they make that choice, you do have to honor it. So if, for example, somebody gets swept up in this, they're medicated against their will, that puts them back in a more or less rational state. And then 30 days later, we ask them, like, do you want to just go back to the street? And they say yes. You have to honor that. You have to take them back to the street. And then maybe they'll get caught up in another sweep down the road. But at some point, they might have a different feeling. Maybe they get caught up in another sweep, and then 6 months later, a year later, and this time they make a different choice. Once they're in a better mental state, they think, well, been a rough year, so maybe I do want to take advantage of ongoing treatment and some of these other things. So, but that's my feeling about this. So I'm falling against the civil liberties folks on this one, because I actually don't think, I think civil liberty, the freedom to make choices, is only viable if you can actually make choices. I think people who are in the throes of mental illness, just like people who are really in the throes of drug addiction, are not really in a position to make choices of free will and rationality. Okay. Now, as far as treating drug addiction, particularly for people who are homeless, more effectively, but this actually applies to people who aren't homeless too. So at the moment, you've got, we have, as I mentioned before, we have, sobering centers where people who are just having like a bad trip or, a bad drug experience can just go and sort of get taken care of for a few hours while they come down. So we have that. We have quite a few outpatient drug services for, people who can manage during the day, but, need some extra service and, somebody to maybe guide them through some social services. So we have that, and maybe guide them to programs. We have some rehab centers. I mean, we have a lot of rehab centers. Most of them are very expensive and aren't going to take people, who don't have money or insurance. We have a few rehab centers that do take people who are drug addicted and don't have insurance and can't pay. They're free because they're funded by donors or by Medicaid. But the number of beds in those free inpatient detox centers is very, very limited. Not nearly enough throughout the city for the number of people who would need a service like that. So one thing we might want to try to do is expand that service. Right? We should have more inpatient detox programs available that are free, that are publicly funded. But I get that the funding for that is limited, and this is expensive care. People can stay in these programs in these places 6 months, a year. The whole time they're being fed, and treated, and it's a good situation, but it's very expensive. So I actually propose something in between. Again, just like the 10 communities, something that's not shelter, not street, something that's not inpatient residential, because there just aren't enough of those. If there were, I wouldn't really be suggesting this, because I think we'd already have it. But one thing, a lot of times people who want to get sober, who want to get off the drugs that they're on, don't do it because of the withdrawal pain or the fear of the withdrawal pain. Once you've been on any kind of psychoactive drug, including alcohol, for a long period of time, not taking the drug, if you go cold turkey, you stop taking it, within a few hours, within a day, you're going to start going into withdrawal. And for most drugs, withdrawal symptoms are horrendous. And, you get very, very ill, sometimes dangerously ill. And, the symptoms can go on for weeks before they really start to resolve, depending on what drug it is and how long you've been on it. So a lot of times people don't seek the help for drug addiction because they're afraid of the first step, which is the withdrawal, and they just don't want to face it, because every addict has experienced some withdrawal. They've gone through periods where they couldn't get their drug in time after they started to come down, and they started to get really sick. So every addict has experience with that feeling, and not surprising that they really are afraid to face it. Now, of course, there are other reasons people continue to use drugs. It's not only this, but this is a big one. So I think one way we can manage this, that is make this a less fearful process for people, is to have dedicated detox centers. Currently, the only places that really have true medical detox centers are hospitals. And the only hospitals that have detox centers that'll take homeless people is the county hospital, San Francisco General, and I think maybe UCSF. And that's it. And the number of beds they have is very limited. So I don't know exactly what it is, but it ain't very many, maybe a few dozen. And that ain't enough for the number of people who, we potentially would like to get off drugs. So I think that, again, an intermediate situation here would be for the city to set up actual detox centers, which are beyond the sobering center. The sobering center is just it can't really do medical intervention. It's just a place for you to, sort of get over a bad trip, essentially. But these centers that I'm proposing here are real detox centers. So they would be 7 to 14-day stays, because that's generally how long it takes to get people through the worst of withdrawal. They would be able to medically manage the withdrawal, because for some types of drugs, we have really good treatments for withdrawal symptoms, which can really make the withdrawal almost painless for people. But, these are drugs that have to be administered by a doctor or a nurse every day. And some people going through detox will need actual IV infusions. They need fluids pumped into them, etc. So these detox centers would be able to do that. They'd be able to do IVs. They'd be able to do drug treatments for withdrawal and managing withdrawal symptoms. Plus, they'd have, counselors on staff, who could sit with people while they were going through the mental agony. Because it's not just physical agony, it's also mental agony of the withdrawal. So just to give you some ideas, I've got a list down here. I'm going to bring up this list. There are certain drugs that it is just dangerous to withdraw from. If you've been on these drugs a long time and you stop them suddenly, you can really, truly die, because the withdrawal symptoms are so dangerous. Those drugs are alcohol, opiates, and the tranquilizers, what they call benzodiazepines. That includes things like Valium, Xanax, Ativan. Those are all in the benzo tranquilizer category. So suddenly withdrawing from opiates, alcohol, or benzos can be rapidly fatal. And these drugs need to be medically managed. If you're going to, you need to be supervised medically if you're going to safely withdraw from them. The good news is, especially for alcohol and opiates, they're great withdrawal drugs. For alcohol, there's what's called Librium taper. Librium is actually a benzo. It's a long-acting one. And so there's a particular dosage regimen you take over 10 to 14 days where you start at a high dose and gradually taper it down. That removes pretty much all the danger of alcohol withdrawal, which can really kill you. People going through alcohol withdrawal can have seizures and heart attacks and strokes, and they do at a fairly high rate. But with a Librium taper, that doesn't happen. Plus, most of the pain and tremors and hallucinations and all that you normally would get with alcohol withdrawal don't happen if you're on a Librium taper. Now, nicotine, of course, is not a drug that we're going to worry about for this population, but just as a public service announcement, you should know that if you are addicted to cigarettes, or vaping, there are drugs that can help with that. Nicotine patches or gum on a tapering dose, or Chantix, which actually gives you the dopamine hit that cigarettes do without the cigarettes. Chantix actually works reasonably well. I think more than 50% of people use it successfully get off tobacco. And then there's also Wellbutrin, which doesn't have nearly the success rate Chantix does, but does have some. So anyway, that's a public service announcement. We're not going to deal with the cigarette addictions of homeless people here. But for opiates, of course, we have Narcan, either injectable or by nasal spray for somebody who's actually ODing on an opiate. Opiate ODs are now the major cause of non-alcohol drug-related deaths in the United States. So there is Narcan that can treat an actual overdose. But for long-term maintenance of opiate withdrawal, you can give somebody basically just a milder opiate. There's buprenorphine and there's methadone. Methadone's been around for quite a while. That's a milder opiate. Buprenorphine is an even milder opiate than methadone. And you can use these milder opiates to get people off the harder opiates without, going through withdrawal symptoms. So, for example, the hard opiates, the ones that, really are a problem, things like heroin and then prescribed drugs like oxycodone or fentanyl, those are the hard opiates. Somebody who's addicted to, say, heroin, or who's addicted to oxy, if you can substitute a mild opiate like buprenorphine. And buprenorphine is a great substitute because it lights up some of the same parts of the brain as heroin does, so it prevents withdrawal symptoms completely. But it's a pill; you can just swallow one a day. But the nice thing about buprenorphine is it doesn't mess up the higher brain centers the way that heroin does. So it prevents withdrawal, but it still allows you to function very normally. So I know a lot of people who are holding down regular jobs on buprenorphine because it may make you feel, a little bit happy, but not like wasted. So you can function very well on buprenorphine, unlike, on heroin, if you're on heroin or oxy, where it's hard to function normally. And the other nice thing about buprenorphine is you can't OD on it. Even if you take a whole lot of it, the worst that'll happen is it'll put you to sleep, but it won't kill you. Whereas even if you take a small amount too much of something like fentanyl or oxy, you can just stop breathing and die. So buprenorphine is a great drug. It's, yes, it's an opiate, but it's a very mild one. It prevents withdrawal symptoms from harder opiates. It doesn't cloud your brain and thinking, so it allows you to function normally. in the world, and you can't OD on it. So it's really terrific. Methadone, which was used earlier, is still used, but not as favorably. Methadone is a milder opiate. It does keep your mental state intact, so it does allow you to function more normally in the world. But methadone has the disadvantage of you can overdose. It's still it's not a hard opiate, but it's a medium opiate, and if you take too much of it, you can die. So, and it also, if you take a lot of it, it'll get you high too. Whereas buprenorphine really will just put you to sleep mostly. So, buprenorphine is now the standard of care for opiate withdrawal, and it does a very good job. So we have really good drugs for alcohol, opiate, and pretty good for nicotine withdrawal now. Now, if you're addicted to benzos, the tranquilizers like Valium or Xanax or Ativan, that's a bigger problem. You can't use benzos to taper off benzos. And withdrawing from benzos is actually quite dangerous. So the only safe way they found to withdraw somebody from benzos is through a very gradual dose tapering, which really needs to be supervised and go on for months or years. So that's a tough one. Now, in these last categories, we have the stimulants, which I separated for a reason. We'll talk about that. That's like cocaine, crack, and then amphetamines or meth. Crack, of course, is the crystalline, smokable form of cocaine. Meth is the crystalline, smokable, pure form of amphetamine. And then there's, milder amphetamines like Adderall. Unfortunately, there's no detox meds for these drugs. So you're going to stop the drug, you're going to go through withdrawals, it's going to be weeks of hell. There's nothing that can be given medically that's going to really make it much better. But that's the bad news. The good news is you don't die from stimulant withdrawal. You can die from alcohol withdrawal, you can die from opiate withdrawal, you can die from tranquilizer withdrawal. You cannot die, not physically, from stimulant withdrawal. So even if you've been smoking crack or smoking meth, stopping won't kill you. It'll make you feel really miserable for weeks, but it won't kill you. The only thing that can kill you in a stimulant withdrawal is people tend to get so depressed, because one of the symptoms of stimulant withdrawal is just extreme depression. People can get so depressed that they just kill themselves, basically. Or they just stop eating and drinking and just, die from dehydration. That's why proper hydration nutrition is actually a real part of treatment here, plus emotional support, because you're going to go through an extreme depression here. But unfortunately, there aren't any drugs that make this better. It's going to be rough. But it's going to be less rough if you know that for at least a few weeks, you've got some good support right there. You're in a safe place, going through it in a detox center. You're in a safe place where people will take care of you, where you can talk to people to work out the emotional stuff, where you can get proper nutrition and hydration, you can get IV if you need it. So, maybe that would encourage some people, even though you can't tell them it's not going to hurt, it's going to hurt. But maybe that would encourage people to, do it if they knew they would have the place and the support to go through it safely. Now, there's other drugs people can get addicted to, and just or at least may use habitually. Weed, LSD, mushrooms, peyote, hallucinogenics, X, ketamine, GHB. None of these drugs is considered particularly addictive in the sense of the withdrawal symptoms don't tend to be serious even if you've been using them for a long time. You certainly won't die from withdrawal from any of these, although you'll probably, you'll miss them. You'll miss the dopamine hit you get from them, or the, hallucinogenic experience if you enjoy that. And, so there'll be a few days there where you really will miss the drug, and you'll want to get more just because you'll miss it. But again, it's not, none of these none of these can be fatal in withdrawal. None of them has, fatal withdrawal symptoms or serious physical withdrawal symptoms. Most of the symptoms from withdrawal from these drugs is emotional, mental. You just miss the dopamine, or you miss the experience, or you miss the relaxation that you get. And again, in a detox center, the support would pretty much be the same as for stimulants. Emotional support, making sure you're eating and drinking properly. Okay, so this is my best idea really for helping people with drug addiction, is to make the withdrawal part less scary for them by having dedicated detox centers where there's enough of these centers and enough beds that everybody who wants one at any given night can access it. And I realize that that's not going to get everyone off drugs, because there's other reasons people stay on drugs other than just being afraid of withdrawal. But fear of withdrawal is a big one. So I think it wouldn't solve the problem, but it would help. Okay, so I've been talking a very long time now. And I'm sure, those of you who are listening, if you think about this problem and really try to think it through, you could probably come up with even better ideas than I have here. This is just my preliminary take. I hope you found this podcast series useful. It's certainly an issue. It's certainly a problem, and not just here in San Francisco, but every major city in the country and probably the world. So not just a San Francisco problem, but something, because this causes a fair amount of human misery. These things, something we should address, just because we want to help our fellow humans. Okay, so thanks for listening, and you take care.